Hi, my name is Javier Albornoz. Today we're going to be talking about time stretching in Pro Tools. Time stretching refers to changing the speed of an audio file's playback without affecting its pitch. So, traditionally, if you were to take, for example, a tape recording of audio and you wanted to speed up the rate of the playback of that recording, what would happen is that not only would the audio speed up in its pace or its rate, but you would also inevitably end up raising the pitch of that audio. So that's where we kind of get that sound of kind of the chipmunk, high pitched, talking, sped up kind of speech. At the same rate, if you were to lower the playback speed of that tape, you're not only lowering the playback of the audio speed, but you're lowering the pitch, and you get that artificial sounding lower pitch kind of speech that if you've ever played around with a tape deck that gave you control of slowing down or speeding up its rate of playback, then you know what those results sound like. But luckily, with modern technology, we do have the way to stretch out the rate of playback and speed up or slow down an audio file without affecting its pitch. I have a Pro Tools session open with several audio tracks and, of course, our master channel. You can see this reflected in both our edit window up here and our mix window down here. So I've labeled each track clearly: narration 1, SFX, we've got bass, drums, and our master channel. So we're going to focus on one at a time, as these tracks are independent of each other right now. They're not meant to play back with each other. So we're going to use each as an example that we can see the effects of time stretching on these tracks. So the first thing I'm going to do is widen our first track. I'm going to unmute this track. You can see that all other tracks are muted. So even though you'll see movement and activity in their level meters, the only track that we're going to hear is the unmuted track, and you can see that it is routed to our master output, showing our speaker icon, meaning that is our monitor path, and all other tracks are routed, and our master channel, of course, also routed to that monitor path. So let's hear the playback of this file, and then we will begin working with time stretching.
The purpose of this virtual reality experiment is to show that standing forests are very important for the survival of indigenous peoples who depend on natural resources.
Great. So, in order to time stretch, which it means that we're going to change the speed of the playback of this file while not affecting the pitch, what we're going to do is go up here, and right now we have our multi-tool selected. But here in our trim tool, when you hold down the mouse button, you'll see that you have several options. Standard is the version that we've been seeing when we are just merely trying to trim the front and end of the file, and you can see that this file is a much longer file with some silence and some room tone that was there as a result of the recording space that it was recorded in. So same thing for the front of the file. Right now it is just working as a trim tool, but if I hold the mouse button over that tool, you can see this TCE. That is going to be the option you select for time stretching. And as you can see, you get this little clock icon that pops up over the trim tool, and now it becomes your time compression or expansion trim tool with the acronym that you see here, TCE. So I'm going to go back to my multi-tool, but as you can see, my trim tool is not as it was before, just merely the standard trim tool. Even when I go back to my multi-tool, we're still going to be able to use the trim option when we're over that appropriate section of the audio file. We're going to be able, as you can see, to use it as the TCE tool. Now the difference here, rather than those brackets that you were seeing before, you can see that now you have the brackets with the clock over the brackets. Okay, so let's say that this narration file, we were trying to speed up the playback by, let's go with about a second and a half faster than it currently is. You can see on our timeline that this audio file is about 11 and a half seconds. And if you wanted to get an exact reading of the length of this file, you can see here in our transport bar that it's showing you the start time, end time, and the length of the selected event. So it's actually just some milliseconds over 11 and a half. We've got 11.589 milliseconds. So let's grab our audio event with the TCE option selected for our trim tool, and let's move it down. I'm going to click and hold at the edge, and I'm going to move the mouse to the left right to about 10. And again, on my timeline, it's hard to get an exact reading because I'm not zoomed in enough, but really the most efficient way would be for us to look at our transport bar, and you can see that the end as well as the length of the file, it's showing you exact readings. So we're going to go here to as close as we possibly can, and I'm going to let go of the mouse button. And you see what happened there when I let go. It happens really quickly, but essentially Pro Tools was doing an offline render, essentially similar to when you're doing a bounce to disk or an export, and it's doing an offline rendering of your audio files that are selected for that bounce to disk. So you can see that time stretching is always going to be an offline process, not a real-time process. You're going to have to do the action and then play back to see your results. So let's hear that back now.
The purpose of this virtual reality experiment is to show that standing forests are very important for the survival of indigenous peoples who depend on natural resources.
So I'm going to undo so we can compare.
The purpose of this virtual reality experiment is to show that standing forests are very important for the survival of indigenous peoples who depend on natural resources.
So you can hear how it wasn't a huge change, but that second and a half made a difference. You can especially tell in this section over here. I'm going to go back to our time stretched version.
For the survival of indigenous peoples who
So you can really hear it there.
For the survival of indigenous peoples,
how the pace of the narrator it becomes a little bit unnatural. But if you've ever heard radio advertisements or commercials where they're trying to fit in the fine print right at the end of the commercial, this actually does happen, and we do end up needing to time stretch our audio, in this case compress the audio, to get it to fit within a certain amount of time. So now that we're back to our original, I'm going to go the other way, and I'm actually going to expand our audio. So we're at 11 and a half seconds. I'm going to expand the audio to 13 seconds more or less. So the equivalent 1.5 seconds that we previously compressed, now we're expanding. There's that offline rendering happening, and let's hear our results.
The purpose of this virtual reality experiment is to show that standing forests are very important for the survival of indigenous peoples who depend on natural resources.
Okay, so I'm going to undo that and play back.
The purpose of this virtual reality experiment.
So you can hear how there's definitely a difference, and you do notice that it's a bit unnatural, right? So you can tell that that's a 11 and a half original audio file, and we're going in one direction or the other, whether we're compressing or expanding, just an additional 1.5 seconds. It makes a huge difference. That, more or less 10% or less that we're working with in expansion or compression is it really ends up making a bigger difference than you might expect in how natural or unnatural we are able to keep our audio. So let's go ahead now and exaggerate and really see what happens when let's go with expansion again. And we're going to go to 16 seconds. So we're really adding almost 50% to our audio file. And if you started to hear it the last time that we did our expansion, you can already start to hear some artifacts, some strange kind of metallic-y sounds that start to happen when you're using time stretching. So let's hear this back now.
The purpose of this virtual reality experiment is to show that standing forests are very important for the survival of indigenous peoples who depend on natural resources.
So you can really hear when we stretched it out that much that you start to get this robotic kind of almost crunchiness that starts to happen as the narrator is speaking. And it wouldn't really be desirable for something like this unless you were trying to go for a special effect. But this definitely affects the speech in a negative way where it becomes almost unusable if you were just going for traditional narration or dialogue editing. So I'm going to undo that, and we're going to go the other direction now and make a drastic compression with our time stretch tool.
The purpose of this virtual reality experiment is to show that standing forests are very important for the survival of indigenous peoples who depend on natural resources.
So again, of course, way too fast, not natural, but you are able to see how, regardless of which direction we're going, compression or expansion, we are retaining the original pitch of the audio. And it's not the old tape recorder style of slowing or speeding up the rate of audio where the pitch would actually change along with the timing. So now let's move on and let's try the same thing to a different type of audio, and let's go to our SFX track. And here, let's unmute. I've muted the narration track. On this track, we have two different sound effects. We've got a vintage race car coming in and skidding to a halt. And over here, we've got this sort of magical spell kind of sound. And let's work with one at a time. First, we'll hear our vintage race car. Great. Okay, so let's just see what kind of effects we would have if we time stretch this, both expansion and compression. I'm going to make some room here and move this other file out of the way. Now I still have the TCE tool selected. So let's actually unselect the multi-tool and just work with only the TCE tool so you can see the difference. Now, without the multi-tool selected, you can see that I'm pretty much only getting that specific tool. No longer can I get crossfade. The only thing that does pop up here is our volume envelope, or where I can add what you might call keyframes, or in this case, automation, where we can automate the volume envelope of this track. But right now we're just going to stick to TCE, and we'll stretch this out a bit, expand that, and let's see what happens if we needed our skid to happen a little bit slower than the pace that's happening in the original. So you can tell, again, what happened. We did expand this audio and we did lengthen it, but you do start to hear those artifacts and that kind of metallicness happening. Now, depending on what software you're using for time stretching, there are offline processes that can take a significant amount of time to render, but will actually bring more detailed and better results than the sort of quick rendering that's happening right now. So, in this case, when you're using this kind of time stretching, it really ends up being more useful for more detailed, kind of smaller changes that you might need. So I've undone that and I'm going to compress it a bit, but I'm going to be a little bit more, let's say here about 1 second, more conservative with how much I'm going to compress. Okay, let's hear, oh, undo. Let's hear that back. Great. Now you can hear how there's a significant change there, 1 second difference, and it does sound like a much faster event. Let's hear the original. Yeah, but you can see how it really didn't negatively affect with those artifacts nearly as much. It's actually very usable. Great. So if that worked better for your scene because maybe the car in your scene is coming in faster, now that's the way to go with a more subtle stretch. Now, another option, and this sort of combines some editing, is that also you can definitely cut your file, maybe the rate of your car kind of zooming into position in your scene, maybe it actually can be a little bit less. You can trim that. Well, if we are going to trim, what would we need to do? We would need to go back to standard. Then we would trim. Then we can come in, we can move our file closer. So we've got a faster event here with the movement of the car. It's shorter, so it's going to end up happening in a shorter amount of time. And then we can go ahead and compress only the section that we want, in this case, the skidding. And then we would, of course, need to crossfade and get it kind of smoothly together. And there you go. So rough results for, let's say, taking half of your file, not time stretching it, and only the section that you might want to time stretch, in this case the skidding, or right before the skidding, where you can have a little bit more control, and your results, because you're not time stretching such a long audio file, you actually will get better results and less artifacts happening. So let's move over here. Let's work with this next sound effect. So we've got this great sound of this sort of magical spell summoning kind of effect. And let's see what happens if we were just to take the entire file, make sure that we are on the TCE option and compressing it by a few seconds so that our spell happens at a much quicker pace. Great. Now you can see how, even though we did compress it significantly, because this is already kind of this fantastical sound that's already been heavily processed, the artifacts kind of come through a little bit less. So you really have more liberty with your time stretching in this case. Let's go the other way, expand. So you can hear there with almost an equivalent rate of expansion, you actually end up with more artifacts and it is more audible, the manipulation via time stretching there. And the reason for this is because you're actually stretching these points of data out, and it ends up being more noticeable when you're trying to work with data that's there and kind of compressing it and make it happen at a faster pace. So it is easier to get desirable results when you're actually compressing rather than expanding, and you can see that clearly happening there with that file. So let's move on. We're going to mute that, shrink that down a bit, and we're going to work with now some music-based tracks. Here's a bass track, and let's play it back in its original form. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to find a place to cut right here before this next phrase starts. I'm going to get rid of that audio, and I want to only work with time stretching a shorter phrase there. So let's go ahead and compress that. And let's say, so this pace at which this was recorded, maybe we don't have the ability to re-record, but we need it sped up slightly for this one phrase. Now, what would we do? We would make sure we're on our TCE tool again. Right now, this is the multi-tool, but I do have TCE selected, so we do get this option when we are over the correct section of the audio file. And let's bring it down by about a second. Offline rendering, and let's hear the playback. So that's a significant increase in tempo or beats per minute. And it really, there are some changes to the audio there that are less than desirable, but it's actually pretty good. Let's go to the other direction and expand. Now again, you can hear how when we went about the same length in the other direction, there's where you really start to again hear those artifacts, and you hear them more when expanding than compressing. So not as great results. Let's see what happens when we check out another track where we have drums. So it is music based, but drums are percussive, and this is a drum kit. So they're not pitch based. So let's see what we're working with. Unmute. So I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to cut just a section that I want to focus on. So I'm going to find the beginning of a phrase and cut at that point, delete what I don't want. I'm actually going to delete this fade here at the end, because that's something that we'll want to add after our time stretching. So I've selected the fade with my multi-tool just by actually clicking on the section of the file where you see the fade. I can hit delete, and you can see how the fade disappears. The other way would be to go to your drop-down tab under Edit, Fades, and you can delete fades here. You can also create them from there if you're not using the tool, this sort of gradient icon that you would get when you're trying to start a fade there. So, all right, let's see what happens with some time stretching here. So the first thing, why don't we grab, and you can actually grab from the top of the audio file here, or rather the start of the audio file, and get the same results that we were getting. Essentially, you are just compressing it from the other direction, but same results. So I'm gonna bring it in here. So significant increase in speed, but not a huge detriment to the audio. Let's go back to the compressed version. All right, now going back to the original, and we're going to expand it. Now you can hear it again. There are those strange artifacts that we're getting. It almost sounds like the kick drums are kind of doubled. The cymbal that's ringing out becomes sort of this robotic, metallic, choppy crunchiness, if you will, and not as desirable. So you can see again that trend of compressing being a little bit more forgiving than expanding.